from a black base coat, paint all the black areas, so the trousers and the shoes, with Corvus Black. Paint all the brown leather areas with Rhinox Hide, so these are the straps at the front, straps at the back, the belt and the strapping on the right arm in this model. Base coat all the red areas with Khorne Red. Base coat all the flesh areas with Bugmans Glow. Onto a smooth coverage of Bugmans Glow, paint the same areas now with Cadian Fleshtone. You could try Cadian Fleshtone directly, but because it's quite a light colour, actually probably quicker to do the two steps. Paint the bone areas, so the skull, the bones coming out of the body, and the bones sticking out from the helmet with Xandri dust. Base coat all the gold areas with Retributor Armour. This will vary from model to model, just to pick out which areas you want to be a different metallic colour than the silver of the weapons. Base coat all of the silver areas with Iron Hand Steel. Shade all of the flesh areas now with Guilliman Flesh, particularly when it comes to troops. Using contrast paints for flesh colour starting points is a great time save. And don't mind if you paint over the bone areas, because these will be overpainted in a later step. Shade all of the gold areas with Fire Slayer Flesh. I often use Gullman Flesh for this step, but on Khorne models the darker finish is kind of more suiting, but you can use really any of the flesh colours over gold will look great. Shade now all the silver, brown, Corvus Black and red areas with Nuln Oil. As you're painting quite large areas in this step, just make sure it doesn't pool too heavily in the deeper recesses, wicking away any of the excess paint where needed. Shade all the bone areas with Wyldwood contrast. Again, normally when I do skeletons, I would do something like Skeleton Horde and then recess shade with Agrax Earthshade, but the grimier appearance of this tends to work well for the Khorne models. Highlight the flesh with Cadian Fleshtone. I find flesh quite difficult to paint, so my approach here is to use very thinned paint so that the lines don't look as stark. And on these models there's actually a lot of kind of raised detail on the flesh. Even things like the bones protruding from the skin leave very sharp lines. Just take your time with it, and again, thinner paint will mean any lines will kind of merge better with the underpainted contrast paint. It's no harm to do particular emphasis under the areas where the bones come through, as these are quite focal on the skin. And as contrast kind of dries with an uneven finish and flat surfaces, I've taken the time to make a thin glaze then of Cadian Fleshtone, just painting over any flat areas that look a bit too messy. I would avoid doing this on every flat surface, as it'll make the skin look very cartoony if you paint them all in its blocks of colour. A second, much thinner highlight of Kislev Flesh was then used on selective areas, really at the sharpest, I won't say points in the skin, but the sharpest areas, like above deep recesses that have been shaded, or any of the sharp detail around the bones. Also pick up the top of the abs with this colour as well, because if these aren't standing out, then what's the point of anything? And remember to pick out the knuckles on the hands as well, just to give an extra bit of detail. Edge highlight the red areas with Evil Sun Scarlet. Again, often with all over washes, there might be a tendency to correct all the flat panels first with the Khorne Red, but the Khorne troops themselves probably benefit from looking a bit less than pristine. So I went straight to the highlighting stage in this case. Again, using edge of the brush where possible for edge highlighting. There isn't a huge opportunity on this model, but just take your time with it and make sure the edges are as kind of thin as you can, because there's only one edge highlight step, and the next step would involve just doing dot highlights. Just to mention that you can orientate the model any way you like, so there are certain details that are easier to paint if the model is in more neutral positions. Like here I found it quite easy to pull these lines when the model was held upside down. Complete the red highlight step then using dots of Fire Dragon Bright. So this is noticeably the most sharp corners where possible on the flatter plates. On the face on the left arm is picking out any of the kind of very raised detail, and on the helmet and anywhere else where there's rivets to peel these out with orange as well. Highlight all the straps with Doombull Brown, the raised sharp edges and any areas where there's kind of a sharp fold. So on the straps in the front, there kind of is a couple of areas in the model where you can see there's a bend in the leather, and I just pull a horizontal line of this colour as well. Paint a second, much finer highlight on the most prominent details using Baneblade Brown to complete the leather. Highlight the shoes and the trousers then first with Eshin Grey. The box art, these trousers are actually quite a light grey. I just found the darker colour kind of suited the model better. And anywhere on the flat details, you can always just pull one or two kind of vertical lines just to give the impression of a crease. Otherwise these areas tend to look quite plain. A second finite highlight then with Dawnstone to complete these areas. Note ahead of time, you could probably just dry brush this step, but for the kind of fur areas around the strapping on the arm, I did a two-step process where you first picked out the raised detail using Karak Stone, and then using Pallid Wych Flesh to complete this effect. Probably more time than it's worth. I just found this area is quite small, so I'd have difficulty dry brushing without hitting other parts of the model. Something like painting the entire thing a brighter colour and then just shading it down would work just as well. And this is just showing the Pallid Wych Flesh to complete the effect. Edge highlight the bone areas on the body with Ushabti Bone. The colour scheme for this is different from the other bone on the model, figuring that this bone is somewhat alive and the other bone is dead, so I tried to make this slightly brighter in colour. Paint a second dot highlight of Screaming Skull in these areas. To highlight the bone areas on the skull and on the helmet, I started with a first highlight of Baneblade Brown. Remember also to paint the larger flat areas on the skull with this colour. Using a thinner consistency of paint probably makes this an easier transition, just so it doesn't look too stark. And on the horns on the helmet, I just took the opportunity to paint vertical lines pulling forward on these areas to give the impression of scratches and just a bit more of interest in the part of the model. A second edge highlight in these areas of Karak Stone then to finish. edge highlight both the silver and the gold areas with Stormhost Silver. When it comes to the silver, edge highlight all of the raised detail, so the edge of the blades and any of the raised parts through the middle, whereas with the gold, I ended up just picking out more fine detail highlights, as opposed to going to a highlight gold colour first. Straight to the silver gives more of an old gold or more worn appearance. And this just showing that silver over the gold, so more particularly on the gold elements of the arm bracer, you really just need to pick out small dots of it to give a good impression of the age of the metal. And this is the finished result. If you like this video, feel free to check out the channel where I have numerous other painting tutorials. If you want to keep up to date, please subscribe.